On Monday, the second largest buyer of Russian oil on the planet picked up the phone and surrendered. India, 1.4 billion people, the world's fastest growing major economy. A country that has been defiantly purchasing Russian crude for years while the West begged them to stop. They just agreed to cut it all off. And they didn't just agree to stop buying Russian oil, they agreed to buy American oil instead. They agreed to slash their tariffs on American goods to zero. They agreed to purchase $500 billion worth of American products, all of it, in one phone call. Now, if you've been watching this channel, you already know what happened. You've seen this movie before. You watched Canada fold, you watched Denmark fold, you watched Europe fold. And I told you the pattern would keep repeating until someone finally called Trump's bluff. India was supposed to be that country. India was supposed to be the one that held the line. They're not a small European nation dependent on American security. They're not Canada sharing a border with the world's largest economy. They're a nuclear-armed superpower with the largest population on Earth. And they lasted exactly 7 months. But here's what makes this different from Canada or Denmark. And I need you to understand this because the implications go far beyond trade. When India agreed to stop buying Russian oil, they didn't just hand Trump a trade victory. They potentially handed him the key to ending the war in Ukraine. And that's not me speculating. That's what Trump himself said. His exact words on Truth Social this morning were, quote, "This will help end the war in Ukraine, which is taking place right now with thousands of people dying each and every week." So let me break down exactly what happened. How Trump pressured the world's most stubborn democracy into submission, what it means for Russia's war machine, and why the next 72 hours could reshape the entire global order. Because there's a meeting happening in Abu Dhabi later this week. Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are sitting down with Russian and Ukrainian officials. And suddenly, the math on that negotiation just changed completely. Let's start with how we got here. Because India's relationship with Russian oil didn't happen by accident. It was a calculated bet. And for 3 years, it looked like a genius move. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the Western world responded with the most aggressive sanctions regime in modern history. Europe, which had been Russia's biggest oil customer, started cutting purchases. Oil companies pulled out. Banks refused to process payments. Russia's economy was supposed to collapse. But then India saw an opportunity. As Western buyers disappeared, Russia got desperate. They started offering their crude at massive discounts. We're talking $15 to $20 below market price per barrel. For a country that imports 85% of its oil, that discount was impossible to resist. India went from buying almost no Russian oil to becoming the second largest purchaser on Earth. By 2024, Russia was supplying 36% of India's total crude imports, about 1.8 million barrels every single day. That's tens of billions of dollars flowing directly into Moscow's war chest every year. Now the West complained, they pressured, they threatened. But India had a simple response. Our energy security comes first. Our economy comes first. Our 1.4 billion citizens come first. And honestly, from India's perspective, the logic made sense. They weren't the ones who invaded Ukraine. They weren't breaking any laws. They were just buying cheap oil from a willing seller. If Europe wanted to pay more for energy to make a moral point, that was Europe's choice. India would make its own decisions. That argument worked for 3 years. It worked through the Biden administration. It worked through endless diplomatic meetings and stern statements and disappointed press releases. And then Trump came back. In June of last year, Trump announced a 25% tariff on all Indian goods entering the United States. His reasoning was simple. India had a massive trade surplus with America. They were importing far more than they were exporting. Their markets were closed to American products while they flooded the U.S. with cheap goods. India pushed back. They said tariffs were unfair. They said they would negotiate. They said the relationship between the world's two largest democracies was too important to damage over trade. Trump didn't care. In August, he slapped on another 25%, this one specifically for buying Russian oil. Combined rate, 50% on everything India shipped to America. And this is where you need to understand what 50% tariffs actually mean. Because it's not just a number, it's an economic weapon. India exports about $95 billion worth of goods to the United States every year. Pharmaceuticals, textiles, jewelry, electronics, auto parts, chemicals. When you put a 50% tax on all of that, you don't just make those products more expensive, you make them uncompetitive. American buyers start looking elsewhere. Orders get canceled. Factories slow down. Jobs disappear. The Indian stock market became the worst performing market among all emerging economies in 2025. Foreign investors pulled out in record numbers. The rupee weakened, inflation spiked. And still, India held the line. They kept buying Russian oil. They kept saying they would negotiate. They kept believing that Trump was bluffing, that the tariffs couldn't last, that America needed India too much. Then something happened last week that changed the entire calculation. And almost nobody in America is talking about it. The European Union signed a free trade agreement with India. After nearly 20 years of failed negotiations, Europe and India finally closed the deal. Almost all goods traded freely between the EU's 27 members and India's 1.4 billion consumers. The EU called it the mother of all deals. And suddenly, Trump was looking at a nightmare scenario. If India had tariff-free access to Europe while facing 50% tariffs in America, every Indian manufacturer would pivot to European buyers. American companies would lose access to the Indian market entirely, while Europe gained a massive advantage. Trump's own tariffs would end up helping Europe at America's expense. So this morning, Trump picked up the phone. And according to his Truth Social post, it was a friendly call. He called Modi one of his greatest friends. He said they talked about many things, including trade and ending the war in Ukraine. And then came the surrender terms. India agreed to stop buying Russian oil entirely. Not reduce. Stop. They'll replace it with oil from the United States and potentially Venezuela. India agreed to reduce their tariffs on American goods to zero and remove all non-tariff barriers. India agreed to buy American at a much higher level, including over $500 billion worth of U.S. energy, technology, agricultural products, coal, and other goods. In exchange, Trump dropped the tariffs from 50% down to 18%. Now, let me show you what Modi said, because this is where it gets interesting. Modi posted on X that he was delighted by the reduced tariff. He thanked Trump on behalf of the 1.4 billion people of India. He called it a wonderful announcement. But here's what he didn't say. He didn't mention Russian oil. Not one word. In his entire statement, there's no reference to cutting off Russia. No mention of the commitment Trump claims he made. Why would Modi stay silent about the biggest part of the deal? Because admitting that you just abandoned Russia under American pressure is politically devastating. India has maintained a careful balance between East and West for decades. They buy Russian weapons. They conduct joint military exercises with Russia. They abstained on every UN vote condemning the Ukraine invasion. If Modi publicly announced that Trump forced him to dump Russia, he would look weak. The opposition would attack him. The nationalists would be furious. Russia would feel betrayed. So instead, Modi thanks Trump for the tariff reduction and says nothing about why it happened. The pattern is the same as Canada. The pattern is the same as Denmark. Fold in private. Declare victory in public. Let Trump take the credit because you have no other choice. But here's the part that should worry Russia more than anything else. And this is where the story gets much bigger than a trade deal. India wasn't just buying Russian oil because it was cheap. They were buying it because they had nowhere else to turn. India is the third largest consumer of oil on Earth. Their economy is growing at 7% a year. They need more energy every single month just to keep the lights on and the factories running. Russian oil was perfect for them. It's heavy and sour, which is exactly what Indian refineries are designed to process. It's geographically close. The logistics are established. The relationships go back decades. Now India has to replace all of that with American oil, Venezuelan oil. Do you know how different American crude is from Russian crude? Different sulfur content, different density, different refining requirements. Do you know how far Venezuela is from India? Do you know how destroyed Venezuela's oil infrastructure is after decades of socialist mismanagement? Trump said India would buy from Venezuela, but Venezuela's oil output is a fraction of what it used to be. They can barely supply their existing customers. The idea that they can replace Russian volumes to India is fantasy, which means this deal might be more symbolic than practical. India might find ways to quietly keep buying Russian oil while officially claiming they've stopped. They've done it before. Sanctions have never fully stopped determined buyers. But even if India cheats, even if they find workarounds, the signal has been sent. Russia just watched its second largest oil customer publicly agree to abandon them under American pressure in exchange for tariff relief. And that signal is going to echo in Abu Dhabi later this week. Because in 3 days, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are sitting down with Russian and Ukrainian officials in Abu Dhabi. And Vladimir Putin just lost his second largest oil customer at the exact moment he's supposed to be negotiating from strength. Think about the timing. Trump didn't announce this deal randomly. He announced it 48 hours before the Abu Dhabi talks. He wanted Putin to see India fold. He wanted Putin to do the math on what happens when your revenue streams start disappearing one by one. Let me show you the numbers, because the numbers are what matter. Russia's federal budget depends on oil and gas revenue for roughly 40% of its income. When Trump reimposed sanctions and pressured buyers to stop purchasing Russian crude, he wasn't just making a political statement. He was attacking the financial foundation of Putin's war machine. India was buying 1.8 million barrels of Russian oil per day. At current prices, that's somewhere between $60 and $70 billion a year flowing into Russian accounts. If India actually follows through on this deal, if they actually stop buying Russian crude, Putin loses one of his last major lifelines outside of China. And China is watching this very carefully, because China is the largest buyer of Russian oil. They've been getting the same sweetheart discounts India was getting. They've been quietly funding Russia's war while maintaining plausible deniability with the West. But China hasn't faced the same pressure India faced. Trump hit India with 50% tariffs. China is dealing with tariffs too, but Trump has been more careful about escalating with Beijing. Different calculation, different risks. Now that India has folded, the question becomes simple. Is China next? If you're sitting in Beijing right now, you're doing the math on what happens if Trump decides to use the same playbook on you. 50% tariffs on Chinese goods unless you stop buying Russian oil. China's economy is already struggling. The real estate sector is in crisis. Youth unemployment is at record highs. The last thing they need is a full-scale trade war with their largest export market. Trump just demonstrated that his pressure campaign works. India was supposed to be the test case for resisting American economic coercion. India failed the test. Now here's where I need to address something that a lot of you are probably thinking. Can India actually stop buying Russian oil? Is this deal even real? Or is this just theater where both sides claim victory and nothing actually changes? Because there are serious practical problems with what Trump announced. First, the infrastructure problem. Indian refineries are configured to process specific types of crude oil. Russian Urals crude is heavy and sour. American shale oil is light and sweet. These are fundamentally different products that require different refining processes. You can't just flip a switch and replace Russian crude with American crude. Indian refineries would need significant modifications. That takes time. That takes money. That takes years, not weeks. Second, the logistics problem. Russia is relatively close to India. Tankers can make the journey quickly and cheaply. America is on the other side of the planet. Venezuela is even further. Shipping costs alone would add significant expense to every barrel. In Venezuela, Trump mentioned Venezuela as an alternative supplier. But Venezuela's oil industry has been devastated by 2 decades of mismanagement. They're producing a fraction of what they used to. They can barely supply their existing customers, let alone take on India's massive demand. Third, the price problem. India was buying Russian oil because it was cheap, $15 to $20 per barrel below market price. That discount saved India billions of dollars every year. Billions that went into subsidies for their own citizens. Billions that kept fuel prices manageable for a population where the average income is still relatively low. American oil doesn't come with a discount. It comes at market price. If India switches entirely to American crude, their energy costs go up significantly. That means higher fuel prices, higher inflation, political backlash from Modi. So the cynical view is that this deal is mostly symbolic. India says they'll stop buying Russian oil. They don't actually stop. They find workarounds. Ship-to-ship transfers in international waters. Oil that's blended in third countries to obscure its origin. Creative accounting that technically complies with the letter of the agreement while violating its spirit. We've seen this before. Countries have been evading sanctions for decades. The infrastructure for sanctions evasion already exists. India could easily use it. But here's why I think the cynical view is wrong, or at least incomplete. Trump isn't stupid. He knows India might try to cheat. He knows the practical problems with replacing Russian oil overnight. He's been doing business deals his entire life. He understands that people don't always follow through on their promises, which is why he structured the deal the way he did. Look at what India actually got. Tariffs dropped from 50% to 18%. That's a 32% reduction. Massive relief for Indian exporters. But 18% is not zero. It's not even close to what European goods face. It's not what Japan pays. It's a partial victory, not a complete one. Trump left room to escalate again. If India cheats, if satellite data shows Russian tankers still arriving at Indian ports, Trump can snap the tariffs back to 50% overnight. He doesn't need Congress. He doesn't need approval. He can do it with a social media post. The threat remains active. The leverage remains intact. India got relief, but they didn't get freedom. And there's another layer to this that most people are missing. Trump didn't just get India to stop buying Russian oil. He got India to start buying American oil, and American gas, and American coal, and American agricultural products. $500 billion worth. That's not a one-time purchase. That's a restructuring of India's entire supply chain. Once those contracts are signed, once those shipping routes are established, once Indian businesses become dependent on American suppliers, the relationship becomes sticky. India won't just be avoiding Russian oil, they'll be locked into American oil. And unwinding that relationship becomes harder every year. This is the part of Trump's strategy that people consistently underestimate. He's not just winning tactical victories. He's not just getting headlines about countries folding. He's restructuring the global economic architecture so that it runs through America. Canada agreed to kill their trade deal with China. Now Canada is more dependent on America than ever. Denmark agreed to a framework on Greenland. Now Denmark is negotiating its future relationship with America. Instead of drifting toward European integration, Europe agreed to buy more American goods and energy. Now European supply chains are being redirected toward American partners. India agreed to replace Russian oil with American oil. Now India's energy security depends on American goodwill. Every single country that folds doesn't just lose one negotiation. They get pulled deeper into the American economic orbit. And once you're inside that orbit, leaving becomes almost impossible. This is why I keep telling you to watch the pattern. Because the pattern isn't just about winning individual confrontations. It's about building a system where American leverage compounds over time. So what happens next? Abu Dhabi. Friday. Kushner and Witkoff sitting across from Russian and Ukrainian officials. Putin just watched India surrender. He knows China is calculating whether to follow. He knows his oil revenue is under attack from multiple directions. He knows Trump is serious about cutting off Russia's financial lifelines. The question Putin has to answer is simple. Does he keep fighting a war he can't afford? Or does he take whatever deal Trump offers before things get worse? 6 months ago, Putin thought he could outlast the West. He thought European resolve would crumble. He thought Trump would be too chaotic, too unpredictable, too distracted to maintain pressure. He thought countries like India would keep buying his oil no matter what America said. That calculation is falling apart in real time. Now I want to hear from you, especially those of you watching from India. Do you think Modi made the right call? Was this a smart strategic retreat or a humiliating surrender to American pressure? Do you think India will actually stop buying Russian oil, or will they find ways to quietly continue? And for everyone else, do you think Putin takes a deal now, or does he keep fighting? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm reading every single one on this video. And if you haven't seen how this exact pattern played out with Canada, that video is on screen right now. 31,000 of you already watched it. Watch it, then come back and tell me if you see the same playbook repeating. Because every time I explain this pattern, someone in the comments says it won't work on the next country. It won't work on Europe, it won't work on Iran, it won't work on India. And every time they fold, the pattern is undefeated. And now there's only one major player left who hasn't folded yet, China. And if you think Trump's going to let them keep buying Russian oil while everyone else has bowed out, you haven't been paying attention.